think of your poo as the greenhouse emissions.
Hi, I'm Andy.
And I'm Roger.
And welcome to The Middle,
where we try to have thoughtful conversations
about awkward topics
on our search to find the middle.
That's fatphobic.
I don't feel war. I just own halfway to Siwa.
A few moments ago, Buckingham Palace announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
I act as if God exists.
Put your masks on.
How dare you! You have stolen my dreams, my childhood, with your empty words.
Do you have foodie friends, right? And they love going to high-end restaurants. I find that, I also love going to high-end restaurants from time to time, but I still like fast food.
Oh yeah, street food's the best.
Yeah, but I mean, even street food now has been elevated, right? I'm talking like your dirty fast food, your McDonald's, all those I love that stuff, right? And people, my foodie friends really look down on me for that.
It's not just the food, it's also the experience.
The novelty of it.
Yeah, and feeling special. Like, you go there, you dress up nicely, and the staff at the restaurant treat you really good. Not like at Karen's Diner the other night. I went there with my son for his birthday, and they were pretty brutal. Like, they were a lot more... I've seen...
You want to explain for listeners?
Yeah, so this is this thing called Karen's Diner. You have to Google it. The whole premise of it is like deliberately bad service. So it's like an American diner, but the whole thing is it's bad service. So the sign in the front says "Sit down, shut up," sort of thing. But it's not just a joke, right? It's not just we'll come and have fun and have banter or whatever. It's like no, they're not letting you out of this place without being offended by it, right?
Yeah,
so
it sounds like my worst nightmare. It's like dinner with a side of audience participation.
So I'd say 80% of it was like on par with what you would expect, but there was just like one or two really awkward kind of suffer, like, oh shit, like this is...
Have we gotten in too far? Just like your Bucks night?
They told my mum when she was ordering and taking too long, in their opinion, said, hurry up and order, you're going to die soon.
Oh my God. Does anyone ever give it back to them? Do they encourage that?
Yeah. Well, you give it back to them, but then but they don't sort of turn it into banter. Like, they turn it into, stop trying to be funny, fuck off. Like, that's...
It's like the roasting. You know, when you see roasting, it's just like, absolutely, someone goes too far.
Yeah, but that's the point, right?
Yeah, but there's like some emotional damage at the end of it.
Yeah.
I'm sure that you go home and you're like trying to shake it off, and you're like, oh man, you know, they were right. They touched a nerve there that I'm going to have to work on. I've got to say, from the video that you sent me, it sounded like from the video they were telling your son to fuck off and like swearing at him.
Well, they called him a dead shit little Eshe kid.
Oh my God. Eshe, mate.
but it's interesting. Like, I went and had a look at the reviews, and I sort of thought, oh, what do people say after they've been through this experience? And you go to Google reviews and you see, 4 or 5 stars for saying, yeah, it was good fun and all this sort of stuff. But then you see like the one guy who didn't get it, who just went in there and didn't realize the theme and just thought they were getting like hamburger and chips.
Amazing.
It's just like, oh, this was terrible. It was
a terrible service. Yeah. It's so rude. Let me speak to your manager. All right, very good. So, Andy, how'd you think? We're a week on from our last episode on empty nesting and kids. Where are you at? What's your reflections on the episode? Anything that you wanted to say that we ran out of time for?
No, not really. But I did, just between then and now, listen to a podcast. It was actually, I can't remember who it was, so that's not a good start. But essentially a author of a book about the sexual revolution and contraception and sort of the impact of that on society. And her comment was that it wasn't really good for anyone, in the sense that it just completely changed the dynamics of relationships. So it was bad for women because now they couldn't rely on the fact that men were after a genuine partner, because there's no good excuse not to have sex on a first date, for example. Whereas before the pill, there was actually a really good excuse why that wasn't expected in that kind of dating scenario. So where it's like, no, we don't do this stuff until we're married or we're really committed to one another. And so it's bad for women because they couldn't pick out the decent men. But then equally, it's sort of bad for men because actually I can't quite think why it was bad for men. But
you know what this reminds me of, actually? It's I remember going to youth group when we just started high school, and the youth pastor there was talking about this. He had this awesome analogy for kind of sex, right? And sex before marriage. And I still remember it today, so it's obviously left an impact, right? Some kind of impact. And he's like, okay, guys. And he was talking to just the men here. And he was like, sex is like a fire, right? It's awesome, right? You know, fire is good to look at, keeps you warm, you know, it's like an amazing tool. And marriage is like the fireplace, right? So the fire belongs in the fireplace. Otherwise, it burns the house down. And I'm like, I turned around. I was thinking to myself, this is some serious bullshit, right? And then I look around, and then one of our mates at school was just like, his mind was blown. He was just so. I still remember like the look on his face. His jaw was dropped. He's like, that's like the best thing I've ever heard, right? That analogy is just alone has sold it for me. And I'm just like walking out of that room going, oh my God.
He was probably just worried how many fires he started.
Rubbing sticks, the magic sticks together.
How about you? What from last week remains unsaid?
You know, I think probably something topical that I've been thinking of. We've been having a few sleepless nights, obviously, with the new little girl. You know, dealing with a newborn is always tough. And I remember through our research into how kids were raised throughout history, the idea that we're only a couple of generations in where parents have actually had to deal with the issue of sleep and newborn sleep without some kind of assistance. And I was really surprised to see that, you know, it wasn't that long ago before doctors and medical professionals were prescribing sleep aids to kids, so essentially sleeping pills. And before that, the use of alcohol and other opiates and things like that, essentially low-dose heroin to help kids sleep. So it's always been a problem and a challenge. And I feel like, you know, nowadays there's a lot more expectations to do it naturally. And the natural order of things is no sleep at all, like we covered. And look, the other thing that comes to mind around kids is probably just how all our friends that don't have kids or live by themselves will react to some of the things we said. And I will go back and say, well, I did say that living by yourself or not having a family can make you a bit more self-centered and selfish. I also think that, you know, I love interesting people, so don't take that the wrong way, anyone who's listening.
And we're not talking about anyone in particular.
No one at all. The stranger the better. We love you. So Andy, do you notice that in Australia it's getting hotter and hotter?
Well, this year's been pretty cold. There is this suggestion, isn't there, that yes, we've got climate change and the weather's warming, and by the time spring rolls around...
Again, you and the spring rolls, right? Seriously, leave it alone. Episode 1 has gone.
Well, better than the summer rolls. But look, 2022 has been a bit unusual in that we've had record amounts of rainfall and cooler temperatures.
Who owns Antarctica, by the way?
China, isn't it?
Really? No, sorry. Give me some of that polar bear action.
So it is getting hotter, I think, and that's what they say, isn't it?
Did you read the IPCC report?
No.
I tried to.
And what did you take from it?
I opened all the attachments, and then my browser crashed, and so then I watched a YouTube video on it.
That's the best way to do it. So today's episode, we're looking at climate change.
The topic that has ruined more careers than any other topic alone.
So I think one of the things we've got to do in an episode on climate change is be clear about some of the things that we're not saying and rule out all of the prickly things that we could be criticised as saying if people don't actually listen to the words we speak. And
we have to be careful. Greta, I heard, has a mean left hook.
We would very much agree with the consensus that climate change is a real thing. It's a real threat. It will have very significant implications for the planet that we live on, and we should be trying to do something about it.
I'll tell you at the end of this episode whether I believe that. No, I do agree. And in this episode, we're putting a commentary on the issues at play here. We are not trying to question or belittle the impact of and the challenge that lies ahead of us.
If that consensus view is wrong, then so be it, but as a general proposition, I have no capacity to challenge what people who dedicate their lives on this topic have to say about it.
We can take the tinfoil hats off and put the white lab coats on because we're going to get deep. But I would say that the fact that we even have to start the episode with this disclaimer probably leads into some of the themes that we need to talk about today.
Yeah, I agree. I almost think of climate change as like this new religion. So it, in the same way as, you know, maybe 30 years ago, you couldn't say anything that would offend someone on religious grounds. And now that's changed.
Zeitgeist has definitely moved on, even significantly from when Al Gore first released An Inconvenient Truth.
And this is why we gave this long-winded introduction on what we're saying and not saying, is because if you're not towing the company line on this topic, as in you're not saying we should all drop everything we're doing now and go and plant trees, it's like you're not on board and you're a climate denier, or what's wrong with you?
You don't believe in science.
Exactly.
And that's some of the themes we'll touch on. There has to be room in the conversation to say some dumb shit.
One of the things I always find odd with this one is it's this thing that you use to signal to everyone else that you're of a certain tribe, that you support action on climate change is the mantra. You should vote for me because I'm part of the same tribe as you. And at the last federal election here in Australia about 6 months ago, there was a whole movement of Teal independents who tended to run in inner city seats that were represented by more conservative political parties and ran candidates that were actually quite progressive for their party, but the parties that they represented weren't necessarily progressive for the people who live in those electorates, and that they wanted something a bit different. But equally, they probably needed someone who could give them their feels on things like climate change and make those right noises, but that wouldn't go and do the things that would destroy their wealth and assets.
We want it all, don't we? So Andy, why do you think climate change is such a tricky issue, stepping back and having a look at it?
I think it tugs at the part of us that values the earth, the planet, and it's actually a very conservative position, actually, when you think about it, to want to protect the environment and to not enact change that we maybe can't unwind. And I think that like a lot of people do have this sense of purity of wanting to maintain, you know, the forests in their natural state, clean waterways, biodiversity, and climate change is this thing that it's the sharpest point where these things get traded off, because climate is, you know, has very significant ramifications for all of those environmental things that we care about, but it has that sharp trade-off with progress.
Yeah.
And economic growth and development and cheap energy that we need to develop. So it's this issue that energizes two completely different groups, those who care about environmental issues and those that actually, no, we need economic growth, we need development, we need to improve our quality of life. And so you have these two groups that are very energized about their position. So it's a
so other
battle
two groups, sorry to be blunt, white people and the rest of the world?
I wouldn't bring in a race dynamic, but I do think there is just to riff on that a little bit in all seriousness, have you ever, certainly if you've been to Europe or you bump into Europeans, like, I just feel like it's a pillar of smugness that they use to say, oh, well, we're not like those heathens in America or Australia, you know, these backwaters that don't care about climate. I do think there is an inner city versus regional or versus in an international context, even, you know, looking at some parts of the world where perhaps they bear the costs of climate mitigation strategies, things like don't use coal, for example, because coal is a cheap form of energy. There are coal mining communities that are dependent on the mines for those jobs, and it's very easy for someone in inner city, Sydney or Melbourne, to say, hey, we need, you know, action on climate change when they don't bear any costs. Their jobs are not at risk.
It's old school party lines too, right? Like the term tree hugger has been around for forever. I find it really interesting sometimes because I think of it as an inner city detachment from the environment as well. So they care so deeply about the environment, but if you were to talk to people who actually live off the land, more in country areas, and are more custodians of properties, you would find their values don't quite match. And there's a real ignorance about that. For example, there's this YouTube channel called Wrangle Star that I like to watch, and he's a homesteader in, I think, Oregon in the States. And he often shows how to do basic skills with the axe, how to look after his property, fell trees. For example, is one of his most popular videos where he cuts down a big oak. And the amount of hate that he gets from people about, you know, why are you destroying this tree and all this kind of stuff? And the reality is, the these people don't know what it is like to look after property. And he responded by saying, I've saved hundreds of trees and rehabilitated environments. What have you done? You know, like, this is my property. I take care of it. I pour my love and soul into it, and cutting down trees every now and then is part of that. And I think there's this real detachment because you just don't know, right? You live in the city. What do you know about looking after the environment? So I always find that quite interesting as well.
Talk about sort of the divide between inner city elites and regional people. I'm sure there's a lot of people in regional areas that are very proactive supporters of action on climate change, right? So it's not just something only people in Sydney and Melbourne care about.
Yeah, and I was definitely out of turn putting race into this, but I would say that because of my experiences, I do think that a little bit sometimes. I know that it's not really race, it's more about the socioeconomics at play. You're not really going to worry about climate change when you don't have other basic needs met in your lifestyle, right? And then there's also this other culture, say, I won't dob anyone in here, but I know plenty of people, from different racial backgrounds who have different attitudes towards energy consumption. So, for example, we have droughts here in Australia, and water conservation is really up there. And if you talk to most people, they are very sensitive to that plight, to the fact where everyone will be fairly socially responsible around water usage. But I know plenty of people from different races, and they'll just say, I use however much water I want. And you know why? Because I'm paying for it. That's the price I'm willing to pay for it, so I will use it. And if I want to wash the concrete on my driveway, what does it matter? I'm paying for it just like you. And that's the price of the water, so I'm paying for it, and I should be able to do that. So they don't have that same angle as, well, actually, no, it's a precious resource. Even though you can purchase it, you shouldn't waste it. Mm. Do you think it's the beginning of mainstream cancel culture?
I don't think you get cancelled. There are some audiences where it goes down like a lead balloon, but equally, I remember a few years ago there was the Stop Adani campaign. So Adani was a mine that was proposed for Queensland, a coal mine. And so there was a massive campaign to stop Adani, right? So they had these red signs, like a stop sign, and said Stop Adani. But the counter campaign was Start Adani. So the other side did all these green ones exactly, like...
For people listening to this overseas, they're thinking, what are these two Aussies talking about? What's a Dani? Is it like a cigarette or something? What's going on?
Well, it's an Indian mining company, I think.
Yeah.
It's not an issue where you get cancelled, because the people who would want to cancel you aren't the people that they're targeting their message to anyway.
So one of the reasons why I think the climate change is such a tricky issue is that it's due to the science, actually. It's such a complex area of science, and it's at odds with sometimes lived experience because we essentially have such a short-term scale and how we experience the weather. It's very hard for people to engage in the conversation, the scientific literature, which is not always easy to understand. It changes over time. And for that reason, it's very hard to say with confidence for the average person what the science actually is, what's happening, and what it actually will mean.
Well, it doesn't help either from a messaging and communication point of view when you spend years and years and years telling people that it's getting warmer, we're having longer droughts and record heat, bushfires, all these things, and this is all to do with climate change. And then the next year, as we've had a couple of years of very high rainfall, cooler than previous years in terms of temperatures, and then you start saying, oh, well, that's also to do with global warming. And of course, when you say global warming, people don't connect that the Earth is cooler for that year, or at least your location is cooler for that year, as being a compelling piece of evidence. So it doesn't make intuitive sense to a lot of people.
There's this general distrust of professionals who predict the weather as well. It's like, you can't even tell me if it's going to rain, in 2 days' time, let alone tell me what the weather's going to be in the next 100 years. And there's this real skepticism about it because with all our advancements in science, we still can't predict the weather.
And I think the other part of it that is quite reasonable is where you have serious scientists, so not kind of the armchair sort of shock jock bringing out some diagrams and calculations they did on the back of the envelope, but actually serious people in the field, and they look at models and their job. I mean, like part of the whole thing of science is it's peer reviewed, and you need that process of challenging current orthodoxy. You need people to have critical eyes over models to ensure that they're accurate, to ensure that you're not making false assumptions, capturing things that aren't real. And the process of critiquing and finding flaws is part of the scientific method.
Yeah.
So the scientists that do go and challenge these models probably feel like they're in an environment where they can't do that without being criticised, being seen as the Antichrist or whatever. And that has a chilling effect on scientific discovery.
Yeah. And problem here is the scale as well, right? Whenever you're trying to predict things over the effect of things over a long period of time, your assumptions and the errors in your assumptions are magnified. But we need to work with the model that we have, which is peer-reviewed scientific discovery. So, Andy, do you think that we are disproportionately worried about climate change at the expense of other existential threats to humanity?
Oh, definitely. I think you look at the amount of headspace occupied by climate change. When you look at the younger generations and they're out, especially young kids, they're out on the street and they're marching, they learn about it at school, and it just isn't the top issue. Like, it really isn't.
Do you think there's an indoctrination that's happens from a young age?
Yeah, absolutely.
You know what the biggest one is, reflecting on this? Captain Planet. He's our hero. You know, like that. I can't think of a better... Actually, like, now that I think of it, I have lots of memories of that show and how...
It was a good show, though.
It was a good show, but, like, obvious propaganda. I mean, not propaganda, I guess. I mean, how would you describe Captain Planet for those who haven't seen it?
These five kids from all around the world.
Different cultures.
Someone from the Soviet Union, some American guy.
Indian kid.
Yeah, the South American.
It wasn't Indian. It was a racially ambiguous dark-skinned character.
Yeah, but he had the least... like effective power. What was it? The power of heart or something.
Heart.
Like, and all the others have these really cool things. Can make like hurricanes appear from nowhere, and then he's just got this
he's got
heart, you know. And then some monkey comes and like slaps them. Like that. That's the. But yeah, no, I do think there's a huge degree of indoctrination. Like the fact that kids go to school and this is the thing that they all get taught. I mean, I think it's great that there are these kinds of topics covered, but I'm just going to put out there, if you want to make a good faith assessment of the top issues affecting mankind right now, climate change doesn't even make the top 10. So we've got actual existential risks that could lead to the end of human civilization, and we're not even talking about them. So things like nuclear weapons, a pandemic, like we've been through COVID-19, but I'm not sure we've really internalized the lessons from that. And then even some quirky ones like AI safety, right? So we're in this period of human history where we are now able to destroy ourselves. Yeah. We have that, and we're proliferating the technologies that allow us to do that. So in sort of the context of big picture history, this is going to be the period where we either fuck ourselves over, and that's the end. That's it. No more. It's the end of history, literally. Or it's the period where we worked it out. We worked out how to manage these risks. So climate change is not an existential risk.
You can have a look online at sites like 80,000 Hours, and they have used a method to rank what the threats are. And like you said, they put AI actually first and pandemics second. And there's a range of other things like a threat to democracy and proceedings around the world. Nuclear disaster is obviously pretty high up there given where we are. Food safety, a range of different things, right? This often comes up, and the other one that I've seen too is about drugs, you know, and how many lives that claims every year in terms of, you know, what you can do and what kind of causes you need to get behind. There's definitely deadlier causes out there at the time, but the argument would be, when talking to people about that, is that you're thinking too short term, that actually the looming threat of climate change will affect everyone in, say, 100 years.
So the issue isn't that we shouldn't care about climate change or act on this problem, but the fact that people are energized by climate change and then their equivalent level of excitement over these topics, to me, it just suggests that climate change is disproportionately receiving attention that probably comes at the expense of some other causes that we could pay attention to.
Yeah. Do you want to hear a real life story that I experienced in the last few weeks? I was at a shopping center and I saw an exchange between a man and a woman. So the man was drinking a coffee cup in a takeaway, and he went to throw that into the regular bin. And now the bins around our area, they say they're not just a red general bin, they say landfill, to kind of really like ram home that this is going to in a giant hole somewhere. And a lady near him said, "No, why are you doing that? You should be recycling that." And they got into this kind of argument about it, and he was saying, he was trying to argue with her in terms of, no, these cups have plastic lining. They don't end up being recycled anyway. And then she said, that's not true. These are the compostable ones, blah, 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 blah. And then he kind of hit it with the trump card, which is like, well, China's not taking our recycling anyway. So even they just go straight into landfill anyway. And she's like, that's not true. They're storing it until we get a new supplier. That's not a reason why. So my question is that exchange warranted at all? Should you be pressured into recycling to do your part around the environment?
It's feel good. This is the motivating factor. That particular coffee cup that has sparked that whole exchange, it doesn't matter. It's completely inconsequential. But the motivating...
Find that woman. She's going to fight you on that too.
Bring her on as a guest. We'll
call her in right now.
but that exchange, like that whole message of evangelizing about that coffee cup and, all the pros and cons of doing all of these different things you can do with it, that was...
You've never felt
that
the guilt
was for
though?
her.
So say, it's bin night, right? You're cleaning out your fridge. All of a sudden, you come across the dreaded half-washed pasta jar. You know that it should go in the recycling, but you throw it in the red bin.
No, red bin.
You don't feel guilty about that?
No way. Why should I? So I think a lot of these things are motivated, and the reason they're popular is because they fundamentally make people feel good. And I think that's exactly the same thing when you go and wave the flag and say, I'm all for something about climate change. And it's the easiest thing in the world you can do is vote for the Greens or vote for a climate change proactive party. It's costless. All you have to do is write their name on the ballot paper, and then you feel like you're fucking Mother Teresa for the rest of the year. Like, this is all you have to do.
I feel the same way, but there are some parts I feel guilty, not so much because I think it's going to make a big difference, but I think I've been programmed early on. When I lived in my first apartment, it was in an area where there was lots of retirees, and retirees are obviously... they've got all the time in the world. And there was this woman who used to literally, when the yellow bins went out for all the recycling goods of a week, and there were many, many bins because it was a big apartment block, she would go through them. And then she'd leave notes for the for the residents saying, you put this for recycling, it's not in there, and I found this in the red bin. She'd literally go through each of the red bins and pick out things and kind of shame people.
Oh, that's
crazy, right?
But again, why is she doing it? It makes her feel good. It's classic busybody behavior, like people calling others out. Like, it makes you feel tough, strong, empowered.
And the other one I had was when I first started work. All right, so I first started at IBM. I was still at uni, was part of my university program, a cooperative scholarship, and I had to review this request for tender. This motherfucker was like 200 pages long. And so I sent it to the multifunction printer. And at the time, I didn't really know how to do things properly. And I printed it one-sided. And this lady there gave me so much shit. And I'm like, I'm sorry. The thing took so long to print. It just kept on coming out and coming out. But she's like, you're wasting so much paper. You should print quarter page, 4 aside kind of thing. And then review it, with a microfiche or something. And that also stuck with me. So maybe I've just been told off too much around recycling and waste.
I don't want to completely shit all over the idea of...
As long as it's organic, it'll decompose.
Well, it helps speed the process up, I think.
Yeah.
Look, it makes sense where you can. And there is probably a part of us that does thrive off those little efficiency gains that we can find in this extra way of like saving a little bit of electricity if I turn off the
earn and save
the TV that's on standby, that little red light, I've just saved like 3 cents a year from turning it off at the power mains. But like, I think at the end of the day, are we worried more about climate change than other topics? Well, I think yes, and because you can't exactly tell someone off because they're exacerbating nuclear proliferation. So people are very opinionated about climate change. Do people have a right to have such strong opinions?
This is a really interesting topic for me because I think that just coming out of the pandemic, I feel like this expert argument or this expert effect has really come into play. It's like, unless you're a doctor, don't be talking about anything to do with your health or medicine. And it's just not true, right? Like, I think, we're not wearing lab coats here, but that doesn't matter. Now, I think that there is a basic level of research and engagement that needs to happen. You need an informed population to take part in these kind of discussions. But you don't need to be an expert. You need to be able to get to a place where you can digest a portion of what these experts are saying and rely on some of the methods that we spoke about. And there's nothing wrong with looking at everyday explanations of those studies, right? Now, in what I think tends to happen is that people shout about it in two different ways. One is what you've referred to, which is straight up activists, and that's where they get their identity. They love the debate of it all, and they love that side of it. They like the social justice and the warriors around that side. The rest is actual academics that they're actually talking about the science itself. Someone who has gone out of their way to try to understand the scientific literature is required to kind of have a good conversation about this topic, just because it's so complex. It raises the second question of how do we consume and how do we find trusted information on this? So if you were mentoring someone and they wanted to learn about climate change and they knew nothing, which sources would you actually trust? Where would you point them to actually get up to speed on this topic?
One of the things with climate change is which question are we actually answering? So the first question is, to what extent is climate change occurring? So the magnitude of the change in the climate. And I mean, I almost see like that's like a computer. You run the simulation and it spits out a result. You don't need to really know what's inside that black box. But then that's only one very, very small part of this whole conversation, right? This is a question about what we should do in response. So you then need to bring in people with different fields of expertise to, for example, contemplate what are the best policy solutions to, let's say, reduce carbon emissions. And then you have debates over what the right policy settings should be and what's the most efficient way to reduce carbon, or indeed, should we even do that? And then you need, so you might need economists to tell you the best way to reduce carbon, but then suddenly it becomes a political problem because you can't all agree on doing the same thing. So then it actually you need like political scientists to come in and so it isn't, there is no one single field that owns the keys to this castle. Climate scientists can only tell you one very small part of the overall equation. So I don't think any individual can school themselves up on this. And even if you dedicate your life to, you'll still only just know that one small part.
I feel it's going to take many experts to decode this problem. The same can be said on how we get ourselves out or what the right action is. Okay, so there is some consensus and agreement about the fact that climate change is occurring and it's due to human activities. But let's have a look at what gets bandied around on the other side of the fence, which is what should we actually do about it? From absolute crazy solutions around stopping all kind of carbon emissions from today, and it's the only way. I'll call this the Greta Thunberg. We don't need talk. We need to sail
across the Atlantic. That's the.
We need to just stop. We don't want to talk about reducing or
stop
halving.
the boats.
Yeah, we need to stop the boats. Everyone get on the boat. Where do you sit on this topic of what is an effective way to tackle this problem?
If all the countries of the world can agree to a certain amount of emissions that add up to the amount that we need to achieve the temperature increase goals that we're hoping to work within, whatever within 2 degrees or something like that.
Yeah, 1.5.
1.5, okay. So if we can all agree and we're confident that's going to work, then sure, let's rock and roll with that, right? I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that that's realistic. I'm not so sure it's a credible commitment. I'm not so sure we even have currently the commitment that we actually need to achieve that objective. So
is it even ethical for Western countries who have benefited off the back of fossil fuels and other things that have increased carbon emissions to ask developing countries to halt theirs to meet these targets?
Well, I think most of the agreements recognise that developing countries should be treated differently, and so their targets are not the same, and they're not expected to achieve the same degree of commitment as bigger, more established and wealthier nations.
But they had no targets
at the time. But then, this is just one of these things we just have to suck it up kind of thing. If the sum of emissions are beyond what they're allowed to be to contain rising temperatures, then we need to look at alternative approaches. We need to look at, what's plan B in the Australian context? We actually have an emissions reduction target, right? And both parties agreed, at least to a certain level. Now, I think the current government is more ambitious than the former government was in this space, but they both actually agreed to a target that would have met our obligations internationally. And the question is once you've committed to reduce emissions, then the next question is, what's the least cost way of doing it? And that's what blows my mind. We have this debate about how we're going to achieve the target, and we have these really shitty policies. Yeah. Because people can't stomach the idea that we would use a market-based solution, either an emissions trading scheme or a carbon tax, which is the least cost way of doing it.
Why do you think there was such a visceral reaction to a market-based solution?
Because people don't understand market-based solutions, and they don't understand why.
Do you think it's because economists are such bad communicators?
I think it's because if you admit that something's a tax, it's very easy to go negative on that politically. A big new tax. These are just seen as costs, right? The very obvious way you're going to pay for this thing. It's a very clear policy that highlights to the community, this is the thing and this is the way you will pay for climate change. Whereas other policies that they're pursuing, the more indirect policies, like let's say, for example, subsidies, these are things that people don't see directly. They have to pay for them because they've got to pay via their taxes. But you don't see how that happens. You don't see how A relates to B.
Talking about those options where, do you wish to add on $1.87 to offset the carbon of this plane ride? Does that really work? I mean, what are they doing with that money?
I think they're buying
alfalfa sprouts.
They're buying some sort of offsets. I mean, this whole market of but this is the feel good factor, right? It's we want to do good things. So I've paid my $1.77 to offset the carbon impact of this thing.
Why are they trying so hard? Like, why don't they just round that shit up to $5, $2? Do they think that somehow you'll be fooled into thinking, oh, they've made a calculation exactly by the kilometers you're traveling and the fuel that you're burning that it equates to $1.87 for this flight?
If that dollar figure is absolutely identical to its true cost, then yeah, okay, fair play. But it kind of then discharges any sense of responsibility if that person actually cares and thinks that they at least wants to do the right thing in terms of their emissions. So I was looking at cars the other day and on the internet. So BYD, it's a Chinese electric car manufacturer, and
you sure they're not collecting your data? Hawaii. What was the? No, it was Hawaii.
Huawei.
Hawaii.
Huawei.
Hawaii.
Huawei.
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 Yes, that one.
Huawei.
And then.
So BYD, that stands for Build Your Dreams. So they've got this electric car, and I think it's one of the cheapest ones you can buy in the market at the moment. And I was just sort of thinking, like, electric cars now become much more common. They're moving from back in the day when the Prius was like this smug thing. I remember that South Park.
You can't find a Prius.
And now it's now like the Prius is like old school tech. But anyway, it seems to be the thing to do. Why do you think people are so obsessed with electric cars?
It's the silver bullet syndrome, right? Deus ex machina. Everyone's waiting for technology to solve this problem, right? Someone to come along and things to advance to a stage where it's like, we've got the solution now. We've solved it and we just need to implement it now. And I think electric vehicles is a intersection between technology advancement led by a cult personality through Elon Musk. If you look at the American muscle car culture and things like that, they've had a premium on what's been cool to drive and exciting to drive, but all of a sudden the narrative on that's changed. Electric vehicles are exciting now, and people who have experienced, a Tesla, but it's not without its problems. I mean, I think that sometimes I see the ugly hand of marketing when I think about electric vehicles, right? Because really it's the epitome of taking a stat like carbon emissions and being really misled by that stat, like all good marketers would do. So when you line up a normal petrol car with an electric vehicle, absolutely the emissions are different, but the carbon footprint is kind of moved to different areas, right? It's not perfect yet. An electric vehicle, we kid ourselves and think that is absolutely emissions free, but obviously there's the production issues, especially around batteries, which take an incredible amount of resources to make, more than that of a petrol car. So the carbon units that come with the production of that, just in getting it to the showroom, is greater. And then also you have to charge the batteries that obviously can't come totally from green sources at the moment, and then compounded by the fact that these batteries will have a shorter life than other cars. I really don't understand why hybrid technology has been leapfrogged so much.
And there's a pretty big trade-off in terms of the performance of the car too. It doesn't
range,
go as far, and 0 to 100 stats are probably less impressive. And I don't know, if I was going to pay a premium for a car above what, the cheapest in that class you could buy for, I don't know if electric's the thing that I would want to spend my money on. I think I'd be going for luxury, extra power, couple extra horses underneath. So have you read these ideas around adaptation versus mitigation? So adaptation strategies being things that you do after we have whatever degrees of warming and we have all those consequences that follow, but we actually just wear that and adapt and respond.
Yeah. Well, I have listened to a rant from Ben Shapiro talking about that. Like 1.5 degrees, why not just, skip underwear that day? I'll be right.
Well, it'd certainly be better if you're living in like place like Siberia. That'd be.
It sounds crazy, right? And obviously, you sound very uninformed and unscientific if you were to say that. But if someone came up to you and said, I live in Alaska, come at me, bro. What is actually going to happen to me? And it's actually, you can quote all the general things, the sea levels and so on, but it is actually quite hard to find an impact to those people who live in colder climate,
Yeah, well, that sounds a little bit like the UK this summer, right? Did you see the footage of how they were all,
spilling into the streets, drinking?
I think they had a few almost 40-degree days, which is, I think, unheard of over there. But it's so funny to see, people from the UK.
Dude, in London, if it's above 20, they're spilling onto the streets, drinking on all the commons.
But it's just so funny to see it, an English person just see a bit of sun and they go out and lay and try and get a tan, and then they just end up pink, because they can't.
Oh, flash tan.
So there's this guy, Bjorn Lomborg, and he has this position on climate change where he basically says there's just all these things you can do to adapt to climate change. And, it's really hard to coordinate at the front end. So, and that we've basically got to give up and we've got to pursue these adaptation strategities and invest in technologies. Yeah, exactly. And we're better off doubling down on technology solutions and things like that. And
when do we do that, by the way? When does the focus shift?
Wasn't it something like Prince Charles in about 2006 said we've got 4 years to solve this problem?
Yeah.
And then in Davos a couple of years ago said we've got 24 months to
it's like a doomsday clock.
It just keeps changing.
Yeah, moving it out. So Andy, one of the things that comes up a lot when you talk about it with trusted friends is that when you look at a graph of contributions to greenhouse gases by a smaller country like Australia, where how many people do we have? 25 million?
Yep, something like that.
Is literally
25 million and one after your effort.
It was quite an effort. It's really a drop in the ocean. And the fact that we could go through significant economic turmoil and a lot of change to our lifestyle for very little overall impact to global emissions. What's your thoughts on that?
One of the strongest arguments that gets made is this one, right? That there's nothing Australia can do to affect what happens globally because we're so small. And it's actually true. It's real.
Yeah.
This is not right-wing conspiracy stuff. This is actually the reality of the situation. I mean, sure, it's not zero, but it's negligible. And so it does beg the question.
I had to zoom in the bar chart to even see Australia's. I went to the site, and obviously Australia wasn't on the country of top contributors to emissions. So I went to the filter and added it in, and I literally had to zoom in my screen to see the bar chart.
Yeah. So we're nothing, and there's no action we can do here to affect the outcome. So with that in mind, there needs to be a good answer to this. It is incumbent on those proposing that no, Australia should do it to come up with the good, compelling reason.
So then it's a moral argument.
It is. But the moral argument only stands if every other country is doing it. Now, up until very recently, we didn't even have the United States on board, right? The largest economy in the world. And then there's all sorts of questions over what other countries are doing. You've got, the anecdote of China building a new coal-fired power plant every day sort of thing. So I almost think Australia should either just be nah, we're going to be...
Sit this one out, buddy.
Yep, we're just going to be bad corporate citizen in the global scheme of things and just, fuck your...
I don't want to speak ill about the dead, but it seems like Michael Jackson was wrong. It doesn't start with the man in the mirror. Fucking get your shit organized, India and America and China.
Yeah, well, until they get their act together, there's nothing we can do here. So we should just keep on going and have, a thriving economy. But of course, the argument against that is that no,
If everyone thought that way.
then you're never going to get a resolution. And we do have a reputation on the world stage. We've also got Pacific Islands, and they're particularly aggrieved by this issue. And it's actually more a diplomatic reason why we've got to be on the front foot. But actually with this issue, right, if we're not going to have coordinated emissions reduction around the world, then at what point do we say, it's not working, we've got to go for adaptation strategies? So let's pull the pin on this thing and just, we'll keep doing what we were doing and get all those benefits. We don't want to double pay, right? We don't want to pay because we've done all of these strategies to minimize our carbon emissions and the rest of the world don't do anything. And so we still have climate change, but we've incurred all of those costs. But then at the same time, still have to do all of those adaptation strategies after the fact.
We probably should include in this episode a talk about the Greta Thunberg infamous speech on climate change. She has this famous speech where she's pretty much telling off the policymakers and adults around the country, saying that don't look to young people for the answer. You've ruined our childhood, my childhood, and our collective childhoods by having this anxiety over climate change, and you just have empty words for us. What do you think about that approach of and why it landed so well? Why it got picked up by media so prolifically?
She's a caricature. She's equally revered as a hero to some, but then she's equally a comic figure. So
very meme worthy, right?
But isn't that the whole thing with this? It's like, which camp are you in?
Yeah. I think that why it was so popular, in my opinion, is that political parties and ideologists, they like using children to send a message. Because I think it humanizes the issue, it makes people pay attention. And I think that's what Greta did. The whole angry child thing, the adult to child relationship has been reversed, and now you have a youth throwing criticism back at adults. And I think that reversal and that very kind of the tonality of it, the staunchness of it, really hit home for some people. And I think it had the desired effect. I mean, she is claiming herself that she's a child and she doesn't have the answers and she shouldn't be looked upon to have the answers. But she's angry and upset by inaction. Why wouldn't she feel this anxiety about it when that's all you hear in the media?
Yeah, well, and that's the thing, isn't it? This enters discourse for young people at a really early age, and they're probably hearing about climate change before they even know that Santa Claus isn't real.
Yeah.
And so if you've got kids of that level of maturity that they believe in Santa Claus and climate change at the same time, this is the reality of the
Paradise
situation.
Gone.
We've got to be a bit more thoughtful, I think, about how we bring children into this sort of a discussion and debate.
Where I think that it's a very irresponsible thing to lump kids with this idea of existential threat. I mean, they have the rest of their life to worry about that, right? I mean, why, in the effort to kind of be socially and environmentally responsible, make them feel like their world is going to end?
Mm. So what do you reckon about these protesters, these climate protesters that have been putting their hands on artworks and holding up streets and traffic
throwing the
and
baked
trains?
beans on the Monet painting? Is that the one?
Oh, well, they've done a whole string around the world.
I mean, everyone's got to have a hobby, I guess,
Just seems like the most ridiculous way to convince people to do something different is to just fucking piss them off. If someone stopped me on the highway...
See, they're assuming that you have an electric vehicle and it wouldn't smoke them out.
Yeah, well, it's definitely not a good strategy.
That whole kind of angry young person, angry climate activist thing,
So if you were a dictator for a day and you got to decide how we should actually address climate change, what would you do? What would be, in your mind, a measured and suitable response?
If I was a brutal dictator, I probably would invade the highest producers of greenhouse emissions and force them to live like pilgrims for a while, study their behavior, learn the knowledge that they may gain over that time, and slowly reintroduce technology back into their lives in future generations who no longer remembered it, and slowly do it and build up civilization from the start again. What about you? No, it's not serious. Look, I think...
Go on, Johnny.
okay.
Give it serious.
I'll give you my serious answer would be that if I was, say, the dictator of Australia, my strategy would be to not respond to the prevention side of the equation now, but heavily invest in technology to adapt to anything that was proved by science to occur, whether it be the increases in natural disasters and hurricanes and things like that. I would make sure that we were well equipped to handle that, and start to look at seawalls and other preventative strategies, carbon locking, rather than preventative strategies.
If I were a dictator, first thing I'd probably do that I think would solve a lot of the problems is take the heat out of the issue.
No pun intended.
So make it just a completely depoliticized thing.
Bipartisan.
And well, no, we don't need bipartisan because I'm a dictator, remember?
Oh,
so
yeah.
Take out the politics, keep it a much more kind of esoteric.
It's not public domain.
Yeah, it's not politically, people don't obsess over with it. I would accept that Australia has to do its bit. We have to contribute. I would probably turn up the dial on us trying to be credible on this so we can try and be a leader. But if we can't, then let's not kid ourselves that we're somehow like going to influence the whole world on this issue. So we should, get our house in order and be a leader, say the right words and language to have like an amplifying effect so that our actions that we take are not wasted because no one else is going to do anything. And then if it turns out that no one else is doing anything, then we change course. We be flexible and our policy changes. And in terms of meeting our commitment, we should go back and have a look at like market-based solutions because they're the least cost.
What about a more inventive tax where, like, instead of paying for a carbon offset, everyone just has a ban on streaming services for a 3-month block, and we use that money to invest in climate change, and you have to read a book that you have on your shelf instead? What kind of society would that create? All right, is there anything I don't know if I can't talk about? So this conversation does get people into trouble, I was just talking in the house about it, and it, just before this episode, just a little bit leaked through and it really got me in an argument. And I think it's because while I agree with the fact that we are causing climate change, I'm still not sold and whether it really matters. So the increase in natural disasters is one that's thrown around, yeah? That's one that I think is less conclusive. And even if there is a slight increase in, say, hurricanes or whatever it may be, our fatalities from those kind of weather events have been steadily decreasing as we become better and better prepared to deal with them.
For me, it's less about what the actual science says, but more about what you can do with the outcome. Just because we've got this problem that in a perfect world we could solve, the reality of the world is that it might not be as simple as that. So we've got to make the best of the shit sandwich we've got.
Shit sandwich, I like that. You know why? Think of your poo as the greenhouse emissions. And if your poo is... I can't. All right, let's leave it.
Don't take shits.